Hello, hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming to today's webinar. I'm Jo Healy and I am the membership manager at the ODI. So before we start, I'm just going to be doing a little bit of housekeeping. So just to let you know that we're going to be recording the webinar and we hopefully will be sharing on social media in our email newsletter, and we're also going to be archiving it. We will be using quotes and extracts from this recording in future future communications. So if you're not okay with that, please stay on mute and keep your camera off. And what I would say as well is please do stay on mute unless you're speaking. And also we will have this roundtable session. And if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat and we will really try to make sure that we answer all those questions. Right, so a huge apologies to everybody. So I'm actually managing the admit all button as well. So that's why I keep looking to one side. Okay, so let's start. Right, so thanks again to everybody for coming today to this webinar. I'd like to say thank you and I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce from the Co-op, Sarah Jane Moss and Tricia Wheeler. So Sarah Jane and Tricia, could you introduce yourselves and perhaps say a couple of words about your role at the Co-op?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sarah Jane Moss. I'm a data governance manager and have been working at the Co-op for the last 20 years, but only in the data governance team for the past 7. So in my role as data governance manager, I mainly focus on project engagement, but I also work on data ownership, data ethics, data retention and policies as well. So I'll pass over to Tricia.
Hello, I'm Tricia Wheeler, Data Governance Lead at Co-op, and I chair the Data Ethics Advisory Group. So data ethics is one of the main parts of my role. I've been at Co-op about 6 years, so we've been trying this for a while, but still maturing as we go, hopefully.
Great, thanks so much both. And I just wanted to introduce Tom Peroni, who's going to be chairing our roundtable section. So Tom, if you'd like to say a couple of words about yourself.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, as I say, I'm Tom, one of the learning team members at the ODI. So there's a couple names that I recognise that you'll recognise my face from some of our programs. But if you do engage with any of our training courses and anything like that, I'm one of the people behind that.
Great, thanks so much, Tom, and thanks so much for chairing the roundtable session. So last but very, very much not least, I'm going to introduce James Maddison, who's a senior consultant from the ODI. So James, if you can introduce yourself and start off with your presentation. Or just to flag up, I will be managing the slides, so just shout when you want me to change the slides over.
Great, thanks, Jo, and thanks for everyone who's here today. As Jo said, my name's James. I'm one of the senior consultants at the ODI, and I lead a lot of our client work on the topic of data ethics, so working with organizations specifically to look at ethical considerations around data within project work, and then also how organizations can take steps to have a more structured approach to how they embed ethical thinking through their data practices. And today I'm going to be talking about one of the ODI's tools, which is called the Data Ethics Maturity Model, and how this can help organizations to plan and assess where they currently are on their data ethics journey. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ODI's vision and mission statement. I think the important bit to talk about here is our mission. What we really want is an open and trustworthy data ecosystem where organizations really participate in trying to make data both more accessible, but also think about the impacts of what happens when you access or collect, share, maintain, use data in particular ways, and how that can have impacts on your customers or the people that you serve as an organization. I think it's really important that organizations are thinking about what those impacts look like, and organizations have a responsibility to really think about how their data practices lend themselves to towards that kind of positive impact that they're trying to create, whilst also thinking about how you can kind of mitigate or minimize harms to people. Next slide, please. So to help organizations think about how they build those more responsible practices, we've developed a tool called the Data Ethics Maturity Model, and this helps organizations to think about how ethical data practices are embedded in the ways that they work, to benchmark against themselves and to really understand where you currently are in your journey, and then to think about how you plan kind of next steps or how you want to move ahead as an organization. Next slide, please. The maturity model is broken down into 6 themes, and you could kind of put them into 2 buckets. One of them is really around people, so looking at organizational governance and internal oversight, who is responsible for data ethics and how does that fit in with other thinking around governance, and how does this embed and how is it kind of distilled across projects. Thinking about skills and knowledge, thinking about the people who need to understand what data ethics is, what the impacts of data could look like on people, and what this looks like specifically in the context that they work within. And then really thinking as well around how you engage with people on the work you're doing around data in projects or services, whether people both internally and externally understand the implications of the work that you're doing, what you're trying to achieve, and they're able to kind of give you feedback as well about how they expect things might impact them. And then on the other side, we have stuff more around the kind of policies and processes. So what processes do you have in place, for example, to manage risk around how data is being collected, accessed, used, shared, etc.? How does ethical thinking play into the way that you fund data activities within the organization? And are the organizations that you're working with, particularly those who are providing services for you or services for those that you ultimately serve, do they align with your expectations around organizational data ethics or the kind of impacts that you want to create for people? And then lastly, thinking about how we kind of go beyond compliance, regulation, legislation. So not just kind of doing the things we know we need to do, but also really thinking about how you can kind of go beyond that and really think about how you can still maximize some of the impacts that you want to create, whilst also looking kind of beyond personal data protection, GDPR, etc., to how you can continue to protect and minimize harm to people. Next slide, please. The maturity model is broken into 5 levels, ranging from initial, which is the lowest level, to optimizing. This is really just to give organizations a sense of what practices they currently have in place. So you may have nothing, in which case you kind of know your starting point is to do something. You may have pockets of good practice where teams or individuals are doing something, but it's not something that's widely adopted across the organization. You may have those organizational practices, but they may not be widely adopted by teams. And then you may be at a stage where there is something being led by the organization which has been widely adopted across teams and areas, and there's a kind of standard practice in place. The optimizing level, which is the kind of top level, is more ambitious. It's more around kind of thought leadership in the space, really trying to push the bounds of what data ethics means within the context that you work. It's very rare to see organizations kind of being at this level, and that's absolutely fine. And this is not to say that every organization should be optimizing in every area, but rather really thinking about what realistic expectations are for you, and what people would want to see from your organization in how you're using data. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give you an example, here is the breakdown across those levels for the skills and knowledge area. This is probably one of the easier ones to really break down and make accessible for people. But as you can see in the initial area, it's likely that there's no kind of fundamental understanding around data ethics within the organization. There's no consistent training in place for anyone. And then as you move up the levels, you start to have good pockets of practice where some organizations have teams or people who have training in place, all the way through to having a consistent approach. So, sorry, one second. So, that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to SJ now. Sorry, to talk about Co-op's experience of using the model.
Thank you very much, James. So today I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of how the Co-op approached the data ethics maturity model. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So before I begin explaining how the Co-op used the data ethics model, I just wanted to say that this is just an example of how we carried out the assessment. I don't believe that there's any hard and fast rules to doing so, and that you can be quite flexible in your approach when using the model. But with that said, we thought it might be quite useful for others if we shared our experience, especially if this is something that you're thinking of doing. So with any kind of assessment, it can seem quite daunting at first. So we decided to take our time preparing for the assessment by understanding the purpose of the tool, agreeing how we were going to use it and what value we hoped to gain from it. We looked at who needed to be involved in the assessment. So for us, that was the data governance team initially, with possibly some involvement from the legal, procurement and digital teams. We also decided that we'd carry out the initial assessment. We'd seek validation from the Co-op's Data Ethics Advisory Group as well. Next, we looked at what value we'd want to get from the assessment. We decided not only did we want to look at our current as-is position, but we also what our desired score should be. And by having a desired score, it would help drive our opportunities and training needs, while prioritising specific activities within the business. The desired score would also inform our action plan, which in turn should help increase our data ethics maturity level across the 6 data ethics maturity themes. We also looked at how frequently we'd want to carry out the assessment. So for us, it made sense to do this annually, with the actions taken forward and reviewed regularly to ensure we're making progress towards our desired scores. Then we started to look at each theme, drawing out what we thought it meant for us as a business. We found that because the model had been written to cover all types of organisations, that sometimes the wording within the assessment didn't directly align to the Co-op's terminology. Therefore, where appropriate, we tweaked the wording so it would make sense to us. We also wrote some definitions where some of the wording might be interpreted differently. This will be particularly useful when revisiting the assessment in a year's time, particularly if members of the team have left since or there have been changes within the business. This will ensure that we had a good understanding of what we'd interpreted the model originally, and that the scores accurately reflect any progress that had been made. And to keep us honest, we decided to share the output from the assessment with our senior leaders, the Data Ethics Advisory Group and the ODI. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then we started to look at how we would score each theme. You'll notice as you work through each of the themes that the levels of maturity build upon the last to encourage you to mature data ethics in your organisation over time. Therefore, as the Co-op had been on its data ethics journey for a number of years, when we started to carry out the assessment, we noticed quite quickly that we were already meeting criteria in level 1 and 2. So to save time, we decided to baseline our scores at a level 3 defined to begin with, and then drop down our scores or pull them up depending on the evidence we could provide to support the maturity level. If you're right at the beginning of your journey though, I'd obviously recommend starting at level 1 and working your way through. And by doing this, it'll ensure that you've got the foundations in place to progress to the next level. You'll also see that each maturity level is made up of several parts. And as we worked through each of the themes, we realised that in some cases, we could only provide evidence for part of a level. Therefore, so that we had a record of this and to make our scoring more accurate, we introduced a RAG rating, so red, amber, green. Next slide, please. So this is our red, amber, green rating key. Red for where the activity does not already exist or is unknown to the Data Governance and Data Ethics Advisory Group attendees, and therefore we could not provide evidence to support the score. Yellow where we partially met the criteria and we had some evidence to support the score. and green where the activity already existed or was well established, and therefore we had evidence. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here is what a mock-up of one of the themes might look like at the end of the assessment if you were to do it as we did. So for example, if I was scoring this particular theme using the red, amber, green scoring, I'd have probably given the company a NAS's score of 2.5 or a 3 if I was balancing out the yellow in level 3 with the green in level 4. It's really important to be as accurate as possible with scoring. What I wouldn't suggest doing is rounding up the score to a 3.5, for example. It might look better on paper, but then you'll have to raise your desired score, which in turn will increase the expectations of you and your team for the next time you undergo the assessment. So that's an example of how we came up with the as-is score. Then we move on to the desired score. So probably say if this was for the co-op, I'd set a realistic desired score of either a 3 or a 3.5. And the reason I've not gone higher is because some of the things detailed within the levels are fairly chunky and may take a business a while to embed. You'll see as you start to work through the model that it talks about things like ways of working, culture, and sometimes including data ethics responsibilities within people's roles, for example, which are not things that can be easily implemented. I think it's really important to be realistic when giving yourself the desired score. In an ideal world, most would want to be a level 5 across the board. However, in some organisations, they may never be able to reach that level 5, or it may not be in the company's appetite to do so. So immediately you'd be setting yourself up to fail. Instead, think about what you want to achieve in the time frame you have. Think about what your organisation's appetite is, what's going to add the most value, and what are your quick wins. So try to avoid using the model as a tick box exercise, as I'm not sure you'll make much progress in the long term. Your desired score should be about how you're going to mature data ethics, and this could be slowly over time to ensure that whatever you aspire to do can be embedded in your organisation's way it's working, or it could be about laying those foundations and setting yourself up for future success. So that's a whistle-stop tour of how the co-op assess ourselves against model. Like I said earlier, this is just an example of how you might go about using it, but we thought it might be a good starting point. So thank you very much for listening. Hope that has helped and has given you some tips on how you might carry out the assessment going forward. I'm now going to pass back to Tom at the ODI, where I believe there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So thank you very much for listening and having me today.
That was great. Thank you very much, SJ. It's really interesting to get more of the detail exactly in those practices and how you've taken that model and kind of made it your own. I'll leave people to kind of articulate and think through what questions they might have. But I suppose to start us off, you've looked at the scoring and taken us through that. Do you have any additional tips or advice for anyone who's going to be carrying out a data ethics maturity assessment within their organisation?
I can start us off on that. So I think, yeah, it's important to remember that the purpose of the assessment is to help you mature your data ethics approach in your organisation. So think about that outcome you're trying to get to rather than just, doing the assessment for the sake of it. So use it as a tool that's going to help you rather than, oh, we've got to fill in all this stuff and do our scoring and come out with a number, but that doesn't help you if you don't do anything about it. So I guess that'd be the first thing. And also to remember that each organisation is different. So when we started this, we kind of thought it might be a bit of a league table, and the ODI published the results and we can compare ourselves to competitors or whatever, but absolutely not. It's very much about your own score for your own organisation. And because we're all different, it isn't designed to be something that's a comparative thing with other organisations. So yeah, it's for you to use, not as a kind of rating against other people. So from that point of view, then it makes sense to be realistic about what's right for your organisation when you're setting your sort of desired scores or what you're aiming for. you know, like SJ said, you don't necessarily need to be 5 across the board. That might never be realistic in your company. So we used that. We decided to look at it in a kind of 1 year time scale. So what we'll be aiming for the next year rather than forever, because obviously in a year's time things might have changed and we might have different appetites for pursuing these things, or other things change in the market and so on. So yeah, be realistic about what you want to aim for, and it doesn't necessarily have to be 5 across the board. And similarly, when you're doing your actual scores for where you are now, be honest, because you're not trying to put yourself better than somebody else. You're trying to do an accurate view of where you are now, so that you can use that to inform a plan for where you want to go next. So yeah, I think those would be my main things. As just make it yours and make it useful to you, rather than trying to sort of just tick all the boxes for the sake of it. SJ, have you got anything else on advice there?
Yeah, I do. So like Tricia said, when we first started, we hadn't quite realised that there wasn't an expectation to share the score in public, and we hadn't fully appreciated that we weren't going to be compared to against any other organisation. So at first, when we were looking at the wording with them in the model, some of the wording didn't make sense to us, like I said earlier, and perhaps the wording was a bit vague. So we did find it quite difficult to score, particularly if we were thinking like the larger picture, if we were going to be compared against, I don't know, Tesco's or the NHS or whoever. We wanted it to be as correct as possible and as fair as possible. However, once we'd realised that the intention wasn't to put our score on the leaderboard, it was solely for our purpose, for our value, we then did start to look at tweaking some of the wording so that we could get the most value out of it. So, for example, in one of the themes, it talks about all colleagues having an understanding of data ethics. But for the co-op, that would mean like 80,000 colleagues, which would include our shop floor workers, lorry drivers, funeral care staff, for example. And those colleagues don't work with data. So by ensuring that they had an understanding of data ethics to meet a level within this model, it wasn't the right thing to do. It certainly wouldn't be in the co-op's appetite to do it. So we tweaked the wording so it would read all support centre staff, so those in the head office that we use in data day-to-day, and that we could then score it more accurately then. And that really made a big difference. But yeah, just to call out, if you do amend any of the wording, just remember to make a note of it. And if you're how you're interpreting that text, so you can reflect on it, further down the line. Other tips would be evidence. So evidence to support your score can come in all shapes and sizes, and it certainly did for us. So whether that be presentation recordings, policies, external facing things like your website, for example, they can all be part of your evidence. And then where you haven't got evidence to support the score, don't be afraid to reduce that score. After all, you'll be able to build collating the evidence into your action plan at a later date. Marking as well. It's okay to give yourself a half mark if you've only met part of the level within a theme. Give yourself credit if you've partially met a level, but try not to round up your score, like I said earlier. And then lastly for me, and this might be really, really obvious, but with the world of technology and business forever evolving, even if an organisation reaches level 5 across all themes, it doesn't mean that they then can sit back and relax and say they've conquered data ethics forevermore. There will still need to be work ongoing to maintain those scores, because otherwise it's unlikely you'll stay optimising level 5 for long. So yeah, that's it from me.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think certainly those elements of leaderboard, it's not a competition. Having it as that kind of living document as well, taking something that can be seen as agnostic but personalizing it for your purposes, I think is a really helpful point. We've had a couple of questions come through the chat, and I think actually they're quite a nice partnership for them both. I wonder if we could start with Wendy's, and we'll lead that into Alison. So Wendy asks, if the company's never looked at data ethics before, what would be a good starting point? And Alison asks, how did you identify who the key stakeholders were and who should be involved and what their input is? So I think well, I suppose the question for you all, where do you start and how do you get people involved and who gets involved?
I'm happy to kick us off with that. Firstly, apologise for my coughing fit. Apparently, I have a sore throat. I didn't realise I have. I think the first starting point that we often talk about at the ODI is really trying to understand what data ethics is and what it means in your context. So one of the things that we talk about is the relationship between morals and ethics, and how really your approach to data ethics is informed by the people around you or the structure that you work within or exist within. So ethics looks very different from my perspective to the ODI's perspective to society's perspective. And so one of the first things is really thinking about, what do we mean when we're talking about data ethics, and what does it mean for my role? What does it mean for my company or organization? What does it mean to the people that we're creating products, services, etc. for? The ODI creates free e-learning resources to help individuals to understand the kind of fundamentals behind data ethics and how it relates to your work with data. Those are freely accessible, so I'd really encourage people to go and have a look at those if this is a very new subject for you. And then I think it's really about building your understanding and building the collective understanding of the organization, and making sure that you're having conversations with people about what this means to you as a group. And then you can start looking at how that applies to the work that you're doing at current, or how that applies to work that you might be doing going forwards around a project, a service, or policy development, to really get a sense of how you ground some of this in the actual work you're doing around data. So that would be my recommendation, is really start thinking about how we bring up that collective understanding of the organization about what we mean when we're talking about data ethics and what that looks like for us as an organization.
Yeah, when we started, one of the sort of practical things we could do was using the data ethics canvas, which is another tool that ODI provides, and that's a whole bunch of questions designed to sort of draw out ethical considerations for. You could apply it to a project or an area of work or a particular initiative or something like that. But that gives you quite a good framework for having a discussion about an activity in the context of, and what's the data ethics stuff we need to think about. So even if you're just looking at those questions, that might give you some starting points of the sorts of things you can be asking projects to think about and asking business areas to think about. So to start with, we just did those very occasionally with a few bits, and now we're trying to embed that more and more into our sort of ways of working, so that everybody thinks of doing that data ethics canvas as a sort of risk assessment of the data ethics of an activity that you're doing. So for a sort of practical thing to do, then I'd recommend having a look at that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I wonder, in terms of the stakeholders then, from Co-op, your perspective, it sounds like you had no shortage of volunteers. You've got your data ethics squad, your senior leadership are kind of heavily enthusiastic and involved about this. So did you beat them away with a stick, or was it kind of careful curation?
Well, we started with, when we were looking at the maturity assessment and going through those themes, a lot of the themes were things that our team in data governance were involved with or in control of, or actually, actively doing those activities. So it was where we came across things where we went, "Ooh, we don't really do this. Where else in the organization might be involved in that sort of thing?" So in particular, that was the kind of stakeholder engagement bit, because we in data governance aren't talking directly to the customers and members whose data we're gathering. So we needed to find people more at the sort of coalface for that. So, digital teams, who are the ones who are writing the apps that gather the data from people when they sign up for membership or whatever. So that led us to kind of look at further afield and try and find other stakeholders who either were doing those sorts of activities, or we want to work with to embed some of that. So for example, procurement, where when they're buying in services from other companies, to say, well, what questions are you asking them about data ethics, because that's not our role, but we need somebody else who can progress that side of things. So yeah, again, using the tool to have a look through and go, well, yeah, do we do that? Or if not, who would? And try and use that as a way of finding the right stakeholders, depending on your organization, how it's structured. That's going to be different for each of us, isn't it?
Great.
I think if I could just add to that, I think that one of the things that organizations are very scared to do often is think about how you involve customers or consumers or citizens, depending on what your focus is and how you're trying to support people, but to involve them in conversations around data. And there's often accusations that fly that maybe the customers don't understand the data bit, and so it wouldn't be valuable to have that conversation, or that they're really focused on the service and that's what we need to focus on. I think it's really valuable to have those people engage in conversations, and that it's a responsibility for organizations to make that conversation accessible. So to really break it down in a way that they think that customers would engage with. And we often underestimate the ability of the everyday person to be able to meaningfully engage in conversations around data and technology. And so I think it's really important to try and look for ways to involve those stakeholders as well, because ultimately they're the ones being impacted by the majority of the work that you're doing with data.
Thank you. And I think there's an interesting link in from what you've just said, James, into a question from Peter in the chat, which is around essentially who is involved, how are they involved, and if we're looking at the kind of skills, literacies, that kind of shared understanding of what data ethics is and what it means for individuals. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on, so if you've got people on the front line who are working with data, people's data, the data about customers and so on, how do you manage that engagement across a much broader base? So you've got the people who are directly involved in the assessment and the work there. How does that evolve to the wider organization?
Well, looking at the question, yeah, you're absolutely right in that, yes, frontline staff will be dealing with customers, and there will be an element of needing to deal with data throughout the organization. But when we're looking at the scope of what we're doing in terms of rolling out an e-learning module, we can focus more on the support centre staff and get a business case to do that for, and that's up to 5,000 people. But to try and get 60,000 people to do it at this stage, we're not at that level of maturity. So it's more about the kind of focusing our efforts rather than saying we wouldn't ever get to all of those people. But right now, with the resources and the appetite that there is, it's not realistic for us to do all 60,000. But yeah, hopefully one day, absolutely we would, and that would be part of the range of our data ethics activity. But yeah, you're right in terms of it depends on who you've got on the front line and what activities they're doing, and yeah, call center staff who are talking to customers all the time absolutely would be sort of higher up the list to target. But perhaps your depot workers would be less it'd be less impactful in their role to know about data ethics. So we're just trying to target realistically what we can get to in what timescales, really. If that answers the question at all.
No, I think that's really interesting. There's a I suppose an element in there of it is a journey.
Yeah.
To your point before, you might get to optimizing, but you won't stay there. So there's a little bit of pragmatism applied in how you're rolling this out, certainly with such large numbers and varied roles and individuals across the organization. So just I suppose on that note, when it comes through in the ideas then, and when you've got these levels and you're looking at what the desired level might be in the work that you're implementing, how do you manage those expectations around what is realistic? So if you're taking that pragmatic approach and somebody else goes, well, we could do more, how are you bringing people back through to I suppose buy into the journey?
Well, yeah, you can always do more, can't you? But in our case, it's more sort of, well, we have a team of 5 or 6 people, so there are limits. So it comes down to the finances in the end of, if you want us to do more or do it more quickly, we'll need more people. So you actually need to get some financial backing. But that's part of the tool, isn't it? One of the areas is looking at the finance and procurement area, and that's talking about what what resources you've got to do all of this. So again, that's part of the journey. So yeah, if people are asking for it, then that gives us a good case to ask for more resource, but it doesn't mean that we'll get it. So but yeah, there's always a bigger list of stuff that we'd like to do, but it has to wait usually.
Yeah, no, great. So it's kind of that articulation of where we are, how we're going, and also what we want to achieve in that longer term. There's a question there from Charlotte as well, quite a direct one. What is the difference between data protection by design and data ethics?
I can do this one. This is a question we get a lot, and in any conversation we're having around data ethics. Data protection has a really specific remit, majority around personal data and what can and can't be done with personal data, and it's obviously very based in kind of law and regulation. We see data ethics as going beyond that. So it's not just about what you do with data about people, it's also about how you use data to inform projects or services that may then have an impact on people in a more kind of tangible way. So it's really thinking kind of beyond the compliance and regulation layers, really thinking about could the results or outcome of the service implementation lead to displacement of people in society, for example, or could the outcomes or information presented from a new web service that we're creating lead to bias in how we support particular communities? So it's far kind of wider reaching than just thinking about the individual and the protection of an individual, but rather also thinking about how the things that we do with data can potentially lead to outcomes in a week, in a month, in 6 months, and so on and so forth, and really thinking about what those consequences could look like or could play out, and how you might try and mitigate those before they occur.
Yeah, we use a question in our sort of thinking of the data protection part is legally, can we do that? Have we got a legal basis for processing that data in that way? But the data ethics part is, but should we do it? So just because you can doesn't mean you should. So the data ethics is sort of doing the next stage of, would we be happy if our data was used in that way? What would our members think? Can we explain what's going on? Those kind of considerations. So it's much more of a grey area than the kind of legal aspects of data protection.
I suppose there's, with that distinction in mind, there's a perfect link into the next question is, do you start with a risk analysis of where in the organization data breaches might happen or unethical practices? Which side are you looking for? Are you going straight in on the kind of more data protection security, or are you going in on the more, I suppose, holistic and maybe slightly broadly defined data ethics?
So it's an interesting question, because I think it depends on how your organization wants to embed data ethics in the way that you work. So lots of organizations like to think about data ethics as being part of their approach to data governance, which is sensible, because a lot of the work you're doing around data already has very strict processes or procedures, already has people with specific roles in place, and so it makes sense to have it as part of your more kind of formalized processes. I think the challenge with kind of trying to do a bit of a risk analysis of everything an organization does and then identifying where the problems might be is that it depends on the size of your organization, how much resource you've got to kind of undertake that activity, And sometimes it's easier to look at specific projects that you might be working on or specific services that you might be developing, or to start thinking about what does good look like for our organization, really kind of laying that out in a systematic way, getting everyone to try and kind of adopt those practices or those processes or the guidance, and then it then helps you to identify where some of those issues might be, because everyone is kind of working from the same song sheet. So rather than you having to kind of proactively go out and try and find problems, everyone in the organization is now aware of what they should be doing or what the kind of guidance and loose rules are around how you approach your work with data. And it can kind of help you address where those issues are without you having to do a bit of a like proactive audit on this kind of stuff. So there are different approaches, but I think kind of having everyone on the same page is really important for helping you to identify where those problems might occur.
Yeah, and if you get everybody to be thinking, what could go wrong? What could be the unintended consequences? Where could there be, harms to individuals from what we're doing? You're looking at the shiny new thing you're trying to do, but you might not be looking at the bits round the side. So yeah, to some extent that is a sort of risk analysis, but it's you still want everybody to be thinking about it, not just one or two bits of the organization eventually. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's kind of the balance of sustainable practice in what already exists, and I suppose moving beyond that as well. There's a kind of following question from Peter there, with an example, so around a 10% discount for students, not being widely advertised. I suppose the underlying point of this question is really around that engagement with the stakeholders. So for you and your roles and your perspective and the work that you've done, where does that level of engagement, communication, and kind of clarity in the message come through in regards to data ethics?
Well, it's certainly one of the considerations from the data ethics canvas is, how are you communicating what you're doing, rather than just focusing on the project or product deliverables. So yeah, if it's explained more clearly, or in a way that seems fair, can you do that? Can you mitigate the sort of backlash potentially of doing something unexpected or something that seemed to be unreasonable? So yeah, it's about trying to think about those things up front and not wait for it to happen and then go, oh, we didn't think about that. So always the earlier you can build these considerations in, the better. So in the case of removing a discount, maybe to give more notice or more explanation or something like that, rather than just hitting it and without the consideration that's gone into the comms around it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think one of the things that we see organizations often do is they do something wrong, they receive like large criticism or backlash from customers or from society, and then they go, oh, now we need to do some data ethics work, or we need to try and smooth over our reputation, or we need to make it seem as if we're trying to address the issue. And sometimes that's well intentioned, and sometimes it's more of a kind of ethics washing type approach. We always try and encourage organizations to kind of get ahead of things going wrong by having these really systematic approaches, having a really clear vision for what data ethics means for your organization, and engagement and proactive engagement is a really key part of that. We much prefer organizations to have a process in place and to have a really clear idea of how data ethics thinking in their work around project services, etc., kind of works for their customers, works for the organization, works for the people in the organization. And then if something goes wrong, you've already demonstrated that you're trying to do the right thing. Whereas if you have nothing in place and you're doing something and it goes wrong, and then you're like, oh, it's okay, we're going to put something in place now to kind of mitigate future issues, there's not that same level of kind of process and rigor to fall back on and say, we really are trying as an organization, and we didn't mean for that to happen.
Yeah, I suppose there's a little bit in there, isn't there, of you know, risk management doesn't mean that you remove risks entirely, but being open and kind of transparent in the broader practices just adds that clarity that when something does go wrong, at least you're in a space to properly and be trusted with whatever the mitigative action is. Thank you very much. Joe, do we have time for any more?
I was going to say, I think we just, if people wanted to, do you know what, I'll say people leave if they want to. We're hoping we'll record this and we'll send that round. So if there is like one more question that anyone wants to ask, please do. But otherwise, we're almost at the end now.
We've just had one more come through, and I suppose it's a question for the entire group. There are the common stories around data ethics. Any examples of any slightly less known or more bizarre areas that people might want to keep an eye out for within their own practices?
That is a really, oh, sorry, go for it.
Well, one area that came up as one of the data ethics canvases we were doing was talking about some funeral care market research with people at end of life, and obviously very sensitive subject, very difficult, and all the focus was on you know, making sure that the data was protected of people doing this survey and all of that. But one thing that came out when we were talking about what other negative impacts might there be that we need to think about, and the project team said, well, we need to look after each other because it's really tough work, and people might be, you know, needing some time out and some you know, psychological help to deal with those kind of conversations. So things like that was you know, we went into it thinking about the customers and their needs, and they came out of it going, well, actually the project team, you know, needs to be thought about as well. So I thought that was an unusual one that you probably wouldn't come across much.
That's really thought-provoking, because yeah, it makes complete sense. But I think that's something that you forget sometimes, that the data that you're dealing with can be quite sensitive and difficult. But that's a really interesting point.
I think just to add to that, I think we do a version of the trolley problem in some of our training around data ethics, where we look at autonomous vehicles and the decisions that autonomous vehicles make. If something happens to the vehicle, do you kind of stick to the rules of the road and potentially harm people who are by rights crossing the road on a green on a red light, so they're able to cross the road, or do you swerve and hurt the passengers? I think some of those things around like automated decision making can get really bizarre, and are really interesting to look at. If you're interested in looking at the original, I think it was MIT study, we can share some more information about that. But I think it's really fascinating where machines have been programmed to make decisions based on very complex scenarios, and what do they choose? Do they choose to protect the person who's bought the vehicle? Do they choose to protect the people who shouldn't be impacted by the way this vehicle works? It's really fascinating stuff.
No, great. And yeah, thanks, James. I've just put the link in the chat. Yeah, so it was MIT, the moral machine. Lots of judgments, lots of critical responses to some of that work on the moral machine, and how the trolley problem isn't really an ethical discussion, but it does promote a really deep and interesting discussion around data ethics, or at least kind of leads into the slightly more critical thought and evaluation of it. On that note, Joe, I wonder if you just wouldn't mind advancing that slide one. It's really just to kind of draw your attention to some of our learning offering around data ethics. So within the learning team, we kind of take those practices around what it means to be ethical, where we've got this kind of philosophy of the frameworks around right and wrong, and then the skills that underpin it within that realm of data ethics. So what are the practical elements that you can apply within your operations, within your processes, within your data analysis, within your storytelling, and explore that element of data ethics and help you to develop your understanding. So we have our long-standing data ethics professionals program, where we certify people as data ethics professionals, not necessarily always saying that we agree with their outcomes, but at least they are kind of thinking through all of those consequences, If you're new to data ethics and you're interested in learning more, we've got the Introduction to Data Ethics session, and then lots of self-paced offering as well. A new course coming this year is the Understanding Data Ethics and AI, and then lots of micro courses as well. So if you're looking for those kind of drop in, develop those broader data skills and all important data literacies, there's a range of options there that you can find on the website. But thank you very much. I'll hand back over to Joe just to close us off.
And thank you so much. A huge thank you to all the speakers and to Tom. So thank you so much, Sarah Jane and Tricia and James and Tom, for just a really fascinating slideshows and also the roundtable discussion. And thank you to everybody who's taken the time out to come to the webinar today. I'll be in touch with the questionnaire. What I'm going to try and do is pull together all the links and anything that's interesting that we've discussed today, and I'll send that to everybody hopefully tomorrow. I hope to see everybody at our next session, which is going to be policy briefing, and it's about your opportunity to ask us questions for a new government. There's 2 sessions. There's one on the 7th, which is pretty much full, so I'd suggest to book to the 14th. And also, I'm just going to flag up. Sarah Jane and Tricia have written I was going to say, Tricia, your blog, it's just a really, really useful oversight into the work that they've done with the data ethics framework. And I'm going to make sure that that's included as a link into the email that I'm going to send out tomorrow, because it's well worth a read. And I found it really interesting and helpful. So my final thank you to everybody. And that's it. And I hope to see everyone soon at the next webinar that we host. And that's goodbye for me. Catch you later. All right, cheers. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.